Over 3 million fake bank accounts. Opened without customers ever knowing. Not by hackers, by the bank's own employees, under pressure from a sales culture built to demand exactly this. This is how one of America's largest banks turned an internal sales target into millions of accounts that shouldn't exist, and fired the low-level employees who couldn't hit it, while the executives who built the system kept their bonuses. Wells Fargo built its retail banking reputation on a strategy called cross-selling, getting existing customers to open additional accounts and products, a second checking account, a credit card, an overdraft line, or retirement account. The more products per customer, the bank argued, the deeper and more profitable the relationship. For years, Wells Fargo publicly bragged about having the highest cross-selling numbers of any major American bank, a statistic investors loved, and one that turned out to be substantially built on accounts customers never asked for. Cross-selling itself isn't inherently problematic. Plenty of banks encourage employees to offer relevant additional products to customers who might genuinely benefit. What made Wells Fargo's version different was the gap between the target and reality. The bank set numeric quotas disconnected from actual customer need or demand, then treated failure to hit those quotas as a performance problem to be managed rather than a signal that the targets themselves might be the issue. Internally, branch employees were given aggressive daily sales quotas, sometimes requiring staff to open a set number of new accounts per day, with performance reviews, and in many cases continued employment, directly tied to hitting those numbers. Employees who missed targets faced discipline. Employees who exceeded them were held up as models for others to match. For thousands of employees, the quotas were simply unachievable through legitimate means, given actual customer demand for additional products. That gap between what was demanded and what was realistically possible is where the fraud began. Here's the part that doesn't add up. To hit their targets, employees at branches across the country began opening checking accounts, savings accounts, and credit cards using existing customers' information, without those customers' knowledge or consent. In many cases, employees funded new accounts by transferring small amounts from a customer's existing account, sometimes triggering overdraft fees on accounts the customer didn't even know existed. Fake email addresses were created so customers wouldn't receive notifications about their new accounts. Some employees later described this practice as an open secret at branch level, not a handful of rogue individuals, but a widespread, almost normalized response to quotas that were, for most staff, simply impossible to meet honestly. Someone was paid to catch this. Wells Fargo's own internal ethics hotline received thousands of complaints related to sales practices over the years the scheme was running. Internal audits flagged unusually high account closure rates and suspicious account opening patterns well before the scandal became public. Employees who tried to report the practice internally often described retaliation rather than investigation, being written up, demoted, or terminated, while the sales culture driving the behavior remained fundamentally unchanged at the leadership level. The bank's CEO at the time, John Stumpf, publicly maintained for years that any wrongdoing was limited to a small number of bad actors, not a structural problem with the incentive system itself. When regulators finally forced a full accounting, the numbers were far larger than initial estimates suggested. What started as an estimated 2 million unauthorized accounts eventually grew, after further investigation, to an acknowledged total of well over 3.5 million fake accounts and credit card applications opened between roughly 2002 and 2016, a scheme that had been running, in some form, for well over a decade before it became a public scandal. Once regulators started digging, the fake account scandal turned out to be one symptom of a broader pattern at Wells Fargo, rather than an isolated problem. Later investigations found the bank had also charged customers for auto insurance they didn't need or already had, incorrectly charged fees to mortgage customers, and enrolled people in overdraft protection programs without proper consent, all traceable, in one way or another, back to the same aggressive sales-driven culture that had produced the fake accounts in the first place. The account scandal wasn't the disease. It was the first visible symptom of an incentive structure that had been quietly generating similar problems across multiple product lines for years. Court records and later reporting captured individual accounts of what the pressure actually looked like on the ground: branch employees crying at their desks after failing to hit daily quotas, working unpaid overtime just to open enough accounts to avoid write-ups, and in some documented cases, opening accounts for family members, friends, or even homeless individuals who agreed to let staff use their information. Anything to hit the number by closing time. These weren't isolated bad actors improvising a scam. They were, by multiple accounts, ordinary employees responding rationally to an irrational set of demands. In September 2016, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, along with the Los Angeles City Attorney and the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, announced a combined $185 million in fines against Wells Fargo, at the time, the largest penalty the CFPB had ever issued. The public revelation triggered congressional hearings, where CEO John Stumpf faced blistering questioning and resigned within weeks, forfeiting tens of millions of dollars in unvested compensation under pressure. Approximately 5,300 lower-level employees had already been quietly fired over the preceding years for account opening violations, terminated individually, largely without public attention, while the sales targets that had driven their behavior remained bank policy until the scandal broke publicly. Wells Fargo ultimately paid well over $3 billion in combined fines and settlements to federal and state regulators, and separately reached a $142 million settlement with affected customers. The Federal Reserve took an unprecedented step in 2018, capping the bank's total asset growth until it could demonstrate meaningfully improved governance and internal controls, a restriction that remained in place for years afterward. Several senior executives, including former retail banking head Carrie Tolstedt, later faced individual fines and, in Tolstedt's case, a lifetime ban from the banking industry along with criminal charges for obstructing a regulatory examination. The asset growth cap imposed by the Federal Reserve was, at the time, an unusually direct form of regulatory punishment for a bank of Wells Fargo's size, effectively telling one of the four largest banks in the country it could not grow larger until it proved it could be trusted not to repeat the same failures. That restriction remained in place for roughly 7 years, finally lifted only after the bank could demonstrate, to regulators' satisfaction, that its internal risk management and governance had been meaningfully overhauled. Wells Fargo's fraud didn't require any technical sophistication at all. It required an incentive structure that made honest performance nearly impossible, low-level employees who had no real power to push back, and leadership that treated internal complaints as a public relations risk rather than a warning sign, until regulators, not the bank itself, forced the reckoning. There's a specific lesson here about where accountability lands by default. Thousands of individual employees were identified, disciplined, and fired for opening accounts under pressure from a system explicitly designed to produce exactly that outcome, while the executives who built and maintained that system largely kept their jobs and bonuses for years after internal warnings had already surfaced. Fraud investigations, left unchecked, have a natural tendency to land hardest on the people with the least power to have prevented it. The numbers always tell the story eventually. In this case, the story was 3.5 million small ones, each one a customer who never asked for what they got. There's also a quieter irony worth naming: the very metric Wells Fargo bragged about to investors for years, industry-leading cross-sell ratios, turned out to be one of the clearest available warning signs, if anyone senior had chosen to ask how a bank was consistently outperforming every competitor on a number that measures how many products a single customer agrees to open. Extraordinary results, sustained for years without a plausible explanation, tend to mean one of two things: something genuinely unusual is happening, or someone is counting wrong on purpose. Wells Fargo fired over 5,000 employees for doing what its own incentive system had all but demanded. Subscribe if you want to understand how a sales target becomes a fraud scheme.